I let my wife's silent treatment control me for years, until her silence gave me freedom, self-respect, and the courage to end our marriage forever. Well, the best thing that happened before I ended it. Let me back up. My wife had this weapon she loved to use whenever I did something she didn't approve of, the silent treatment. Not just a few hours of quiet, but days, sometimes weeks of complete radio silence. No good morning. No, how was your day? Nothing. She'd move around the house like I was invisible, eating meals without setting a place for me, watching television with the volume just loud enough that I knew she was deliberately ignoring me. This time it started over something ridiculous. I wanted to meet up with a couple of guys from work to watch the playoff game at a sports bar. Just a normal Thursday night, nothing crazy. When I mentioned it during dinner, she put down her fork and gave me that look. So, you'd rather spend time with your drinking buddies than your wife? I tried explaining it wasn't about choosing anyone over her. I just wanted to watch the game with friends. But she had this way of twisting everything. According to her, wanting any social life outside our marriage meant I didn't value our relationship. God forbid I wanted to grab a beer and watch football without her commentary about how violent and stupid sports were. Fine, she said, standing up from the table. Go have your little boys' night. Don't expect me to be here waiting for you. I should have recognized the trap, but I was tired of walking on eggshells. Actually, I think I will go. Thanks for understanding. That was it. The conversation that triggered 3 weeks of absolute silence. For the first few days, I did what I always did. I apologized. I tried to explain myself. I brought her coffee in the morning, asked if she wanted to talk, offered to skip future plans with friends. It was the usual routine where I basically begged for forgiveness for the crime of having a social life. But she wasn't budging this time. She'd perfected this psychological warfare over our 5 years of marriage. The silent treatment was her nuclear option, and it usually worked. I'd cave within a week, sometimes less, agreeing to whatever boundaries she wanted to set just to get her talking again. Except this time felt different. Maybe I was just exhausted from years of this cycle. The argument, the silent treatment, my desperate attempts to fix whatever I'd apparently broken, then her graciously forgiving me with a list of new rules about what I couldn't do anymore. I realized she wasn't just giving me the silent treatment. She was giving me space to think. And the more I thought, the more I started noticing things I'd been too busy apologizing to see, like how she'd managed to eliminate most of my friendships over the years. It was never direct. She'd just make comments about how much time I spent with those people or how they were bad influences. When I'd come home from hanging out with anyone, she'd be cold and distant until I felt guilty enough to decline the next invitation. Or how she'd somehow convinced me that my hobbies were inconsiderate. I used to love watching crime shows, but according to her, they were too violent and disturbing. She'd sit there sighing and making comments about how dark and depressing they were until I changed the channel just to avoid the drama. The gym membership I bought last year, she'd killed that too. Every time I mentioned working out, she'd tell me how perfect I was already and how she didn't understand why I needed to change anything about myself. It sounded supportive until I realized she was threatened by the idea of me improving myself or spending time anywhere that wasn't with her. But now, with her refusing to speak to me, I had this weird freedom I hadn't experienced in years. I could watch whatever I wanted on television. I could text my old friends without getting interrogated about it later. I could go to the gym without a guilt trip. And you know what? For the first time in years, I wasn't walking around my own house feeling like I was about to trigger another argument. By day 10 of her silent treatment, I was starting to understand something she probably never intended me to figure out. This wasn't punishment. This was a preview of what my life could actually be like. By the end of the first week, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I stopped trying to fix whatever was supposedly broken between us. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I lived like I wanted to live. First thing I did was text my buddy from work about that basketball game coming up, the one she would have found 50 reasons I shouldn't attend. Within 1 hour, we had plans for the weekend. No negotiation, no guilt trip, no explanation required. That night, I settled into my recliner with a beer and turned on one of those detective shows she always complained about. The house was quiet except for the television, and for the first time in months, I actually relaxed. No commentary about how disturbing the content was. No heavy sighs from across the room. No passive-aggressive channel-changing suggestions. She walked through the living room 2 times while I was watching, each time making her presence known by unnecessarily rearranging things on the coffee table or loudly closing cabinet doors in the kitchen. I kept my eyes on the screen. If she wanted to play the invisible game, I could play it too. The next morning, I did something that would have triggered a massive argument just a week ago. I signed up for a gym membership. The same gym I'd mentioned wanting to join months earlier, back when she convinced me I was perfect just the way I was and didn't need to waste money on unnecessary fitness goals. When I got home that evening with the gym bag I'd picked up, she was in the kitchen making dinner. She glanced at the bag and I saw her jaw tighten, but she maintained her silent treatment. Perfect. I headed upstairs to change into workout clothes. At the gym, I ran into another guy from my old friend group, someone I hadn't talked to in over 1 year. We ended up working out together, and he mentioned how he'd wondered what happened to me. Apparently, I just vanished from their social circle without explanation. I knew what had happened. Every time they'd invited me anywhere, she'd had some reason I couldn't go. A dinner she'd already planned, a family obligation that mysteriously appeared, or just the simple fact that she'd had a really hard day and needed me home. But tonight, when he invited me to grab food after our workout, I said yes. Just like that. No checking with anyone. No elaborate explanation about why I might be unavailable. I was a grown man making plans with a friend. We went to this burger place downtown. Nothing fancy, just good food and easy conversation. He told me about his new job, his girlfriend, some mutual friends I'd lost touch with. Normal stuff, adult conversation without someone monitoring every word or making mental notes for later criticism. When I got home around 9 o'clock, she was already upstairs. I could hear her moving around in the bedroom, probably making enough noise to let me know she was aware of my late arrival. I grabbed another beer and watched the late game highlights. The second week started with me establishing a routine I hadn't had in years. Gym before work, actually taking my lunch break instead of eating at my desk, and plans almost every evening. Not because I was trying to avoid her, but because I was remembering what I enjoyed doing. Tuesday night was dinner with 2 college friends who'd given up inviting me places years ago. Wednesday, I stayed late at the gym and tried that boxing class I'd always wanted to take. Thursday was the basketball game I'd originally wanted to attend 3 weeks earlier. Each night I came home, she'd be there, maintaining her silence but watching everything I did. I could see her getting more frustrated as the days went by. This wasn't going according to her usual script. Normally by now, I would have broken. I'd have sat her down and begged for another chance to explain myself, promised to do better, agreed to whatever restrictions she wanted to place on my social life. But I wasn't doing any of that. Instead, I was discovering something interesting. Without her constant criticism and control, I was actually enjoying my life again. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make spontaneous plans, to have conversations that didn't require walking through a minefield of potential triggers, to come home feeling energized instead of drained. By Friday of the second week, I was in the best mood I'd been in for months. I'd lost a few pounds from the gym routine, reconnected with friends who genuinely seemed happy to have me back, and rediscovered hobbies I'd abandoned to keep peace in my marriage. That's when I decided to have a little fun with the situation. I stopped at the store and bought a box of expensive chocolates, the kind she actually liked, not the cheap stuff. When I got home, I placed them on the kitchen counter with a note that read, "Best 20 to 1 days ever." I finally understand why monks take vows of silence. I left them there and went upstairs to shower. When I came back down, the chocolates were gone, but the note was still there. She'd read it, taken the chocolates, but couldn't respond without breaking her precious silent treatment. For the first time in our marriage, I had the upper hand, and I was just getting started. The chocolate note hit exactly the nerve I was aiming for. Over the next few days, I could feel her frustration building like pressure in a steam cooker. She'd stomp around the house just a little louder, slam doors with just a bit more force, and find increasingly creative ways to let me know she was furious without actually speaking. But here's the thing about silent treatments. When you stop caring about them, they become someone else's problem, not yours. I doubled down on everything that was apparently driving her crazy. My morning routine now included protein shakes, which meant using the blender at 6:30 in the morning. She'd appear in the kitchen with murder in her eyes. But since she couldn't complain without breaking her silence, she'd just grab her coffee and disappear upstairs. The gym had become non-negotiable. Every day after work, sometimes even during lunch breaks, I was getting results too. My clothes fit better. I had more energy, and I was sleeping better than I had in years. The kind of sleep you get when you're not constantly stressed about stepping on emotional landmines. My social calendar was busier than it had been since college. Sunday afternoon football with the guys, Wednesday night poker games, Friday happy hours that actually stayed happy because nobody was texting me every 20 minutes asking when I'd be home. She hated all of it. I could see it in the way she'd watch me get ready to leave, the way she'd position herself in whatever room I was getting dressed in, clearly wanting to say something but trapped by her own punishment strategy. The best part was how obvious her attempts to break my routine had become. She'd suddenly need help with something right when I was heading to the gym. She'd start cooking elaborate dinners at exactly the time I usually met friends for drinks. She'd develop mysterious headaches or bad days that historically would have made me cancel my plans to stay home and comfort her. But I wasn't taking the bait anymore. When she'd appear with that particular expression that used to make me ask what was wrong, I just grabbed my keys and head out. Her problems had become exactly that, her problems. 2.5 weeks in, I realized I was fundamentally different than I'd been 1 month ago. Not just physically, though the gym routine was paying off. Mentally, I was sharper, more confident. I was making decisions without second-guessing how they'd affect her mood. I was having conversations, without mentally preparing for the interrogation that would follow. I was remembering who I used to be before I'd spent 5 years managing someone else's emotions. That's when it hit me. This wasn't temporary. I didn't want to go back to the way things were. I didn't want to return to asking permission for basic adult activities, to avoiding friends she disapproved of, to pretending I enjoyed the life she designed for us. The silent treatment that was supposed to punish me had accidentally given me a roadmap to freedom. And now I needed to make that freedom permanent. I started paying attention to details I'd ignored for years, like how the house was actually in my name because I'd bought it 2 years before we got married, how most of our joint accounts had been funded primarily by my income, how the car she drove every day was titled to me. These weren't vengeful thoughts, they were practical observations, from someone who was beginning to understand that this relationship had an expiration date, and I needed to be prepared. When that date arrived, I also started noticing how isolated I'd become. Most of my old friends had stopped calling years ago, probably tired of me declining invitations or leaving early because she needed me home. My family saw us maybe 2 times a year because she always found reasons to skip gatherings or cut visits short. But in just 2 weeks of living without her approval, I'd reconnected with people who actually seemed to enjoy my company. People who didn't critique my choices or make me feel guilty for having interests outside of our relationship. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On day 18, I made another chocolate run. This time I left a different note. Day 18. Starting to think this silence thing might be your greatest idea yet. Thanks for the clarity. I wasn't just provoking her anymore. I was telling the truth. Her silent treatment had given me the clarity to see our marriage for what it really was. A long, slow suffocation of everything that made me who I was. When I came home from the gym that night, I could hear her on the phone upstairs, probably talking to her sister or her mother about what a terrible husband I was being. Good. Let her explain how her punishment strategy had backfired so spectacularly that her husband was thriving without her attention. I had 3 more days of silence to figure out exactly how I wanted this to end, because it was definitely going to end. Day 19 changed everything, not because of anything she did, but because of a conversation I had with my lawyer. I called him that morning, from my office, ostensibly to ask about updating my will. But 20 minutes into the conversation, I found myself asking different questions. Questions about property division, about divorce timelines, about what rights someone had when they'd been living in a house they didn't own. He was professional about it, didn't ask for details, just laid out the facts. The house was mine, purchased before marriage. The car she drove was in my name. Our joint checking account could be closed by either party. She'd have 30 days to vacate if I provided proper notice. "Are you planning to file?" he asked. I stared out my office window at the parking lot below. I'm planning to be prepared. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 5 years of marriage. I went through our financial records without her knowledge, bank statements, credit card bills, investment accounts, everything. What I found was enlightening. Over the past 5 years, she'd contributed maybe 20% to our household expenses. Her part-time job at the boutique barely covered her personal shopping, which turned out to be substantially more expensive than I'd realized. The joint credit card she used for groceries and household items showed charges at high-end clothing stores, expensive restaurants with her friends, and spa treatments I'd never heard about. I wasn't angry about the money. I was angry about the lie. She had positioned herself as an equal partner in our marriage while living off my income and criticizing how I chose to spend my free time. That evening, I opened a new checking account at a different bank, not to hide money, but to establish independence. Then I updated my direct deposit to split between the old joint account and my new individual one. She'd still have access to money, but I'd have security. When I got home from handling these errands, she was in the kitchen again, making dinner for one. She glanced at the bank paperwork I'd left on the counter, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not just anger this time, but concern. Good. She should be concerned. Day 20 brought more preparations. I called a moving company to get estimates for packing and storage services. Not because I was leaving, this was my house, but because someone else would be. I scheduled the consultation for the following week after her silent treatment deadline had passed. I also did something that felt both liberating and final. I called my brother, who I hadn't talked to in months because she'd convinced me he was too negative and always stirring up drama. Turned out he'd been wondering where I disappeared to and was genuinely happy to hear from me. We talked for over 1 hour about work, about his kids, about plans for the upcoming holidays that wouldn't involve walking on eggshells or leaving early because someone was having a difficult time at family gatherings. "You sound different," he said before we hung up. "Better, more like yourself." He was right. I was becoming myself again, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. That night, I sat in my recliner with a beer and my laptop, researching divorce attorneys. Not my business lawyer, who was great for contracts and wills, but someone who specialized in family law. Someone who could walk me through the process efficiently and fairly. I bookmarked 3 websites and made notes about consultation schedules. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I was preparing for the inevitable, because that's what this had become, inevitable. She walked through the living room while I was researching, probably heading to the kitchen for one of her late-night snacks. She glanced at my laptop screen and I didn't bother closing it. Let her see, let her start understanding that her silent treatment had consequences she hadn't anticipated. I could feel her hovering near the doorway, probably trying to read more of what I was looking at. For a moment, I thought she might break her silence right then, might ask what I was doing, or demand an explanation. But she didn't. She maintained her commitment to not speaking, even though it was clearly killing her to stay quiet. Perfect. One more day of this charade and then I'd show her exactly what I'd accomplished during her 3 weeks of silence. Tomorrow was day 21. The day her punishment was supposed to end and our normal routine was supposed to resume. The day I was supposed to apologize, promise to do better, and submit to whatever new restrictions she decided to impose. Instead, tomorrow was going to be the day I handed her divorce papers and a 30-day notice to vacate my house. Her silent treatment was about to end, but not the way she'd planned. Day 21 arrived like Christmas morning, except I was the one with the gifts to give. I woke up early, hit the gym for what had become my standard morning routine, and came home to find her in the kitchen making coffee. She looked at me expectantly, probably waiting for some acknowledgement that her punishment period was officially over and I was ready to grovel. Instead, I poured my own coffee, grabbed my protein shake ingredients, and started my usual morning routine. The blender was particularly loud that morning. She was still maintaining the silence, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to make the first move toward reconciliation. That's how this usually worked. She'd break me down with days or weeks of cold treatment, then graciously allow me to apologize and promise to do better. Not today. I went to work, handled my usual responsibilities, and met my lawyer during lunch to pick up the papers I requested. Divorce petition, property settlement agreement, and 30-day notice to vacate. All professionally prepared, all legally sound. When I got home that evening, she was in the living room watching one of her reality shows, the same shows she'd always criticized me for not enjoying, claiming they were beneath our intellectual level. Funny how her standards had relaxed during her silent treatment. I walked past her without acknowledgement and went to the kitchen to start dinner for myself, just like I'd been doing for 3 weeks. That's when I heard her get up from the couch. Her footsteps followed me to the kitchen where she stood in the doorway like she was building up courage for something. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out ingredients for a steak dinner. The good steaks I bought for myself, not the chicken or fish she usually insisted we eat because red meat was too heavy. Seriously, the first word she'd spoken in 21 days. I didn't look up from seasoning the steak. Seriously, what? The chocolate notes, the attitude, acting like this is all some big joke. I turned around slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time in 3 weeks. "Oh, we're talking now? I thought we were still playing the silent game." Her face flushed. "I wasn't playing games, I was waiting for you to realize what you'd done wrong and apologize." "What I'd done wrong?" I repeated it like I was testing the words. "You mean wanting to watch a basketball game with friends? You know, it wasn't about the game. It was about your priorities. About choosing other people over your wife." Here it was, the same script we performed dozens of times. This was where I was supposed to apologize, explain that she'd misunderstood my intentions, promise to prioritize her feelings over everything else in my life. Instead, I walked to the counter where I'd placed a manila envelope that morning. The envelope I'd been carrying around all day, waiting for this exact moment. "You're right," I said, pulling out the papers. "It was about priorities. and I've spent 3 weeks figuring out exactly what mine are. I handed her the divorce petition. She stared at it like it was written in a foreign language. What is this? Your answer. You wanted to know what choosing other people over my wife looks like. This is it. I'm choosing myself. The color drained from her face as she flipped through the pages. You can't be serious. This is about one stupid fight. This isn't about one fight. This is about 5 years of you using silence as a weapon. 5 years of you sabotaging my friendships, criticizing my interests, and making me feel guilty for existing as an individual human being. She set the papers down with shaking hands. We can work this out. Couples therapy, marriage counseling, whatever you want. I pulled out the second set of papers. This is a 30-day notice to vacate. The house is in my name, purchased before our marriage. You have 1 month to find somewhere else to live. Now she was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You can't just kick me out. I live here. You live here because I allowed it. Just like you had friends because I funded your social life. Drove a car because I paid for it. And had the luxury of working part-time because I covered our actual expenses. That's not fair. I contributed to this marriage by doing what? Monitoring my friendships, criticizing my hobbies, using emotional manipulation every time I wanted to do something you didn't approve of. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. For once in our relationship, she didn't have a comeback ready. 3 weeks ago, you stopped talking to me because I wanted to watch a game with friends. You thought you were punishing me. Instead, you gave me the best 3 weeks of my marriage. You showed me what life could be like without your constant disapproval and control. I gestured toward the papers in her hands. Those are the results of your silent treatment. I used that time to remember who I was before I spent 5 years managing your emotions. I used it to reconnect with friends you'd driven away. I used it to rediscover interests you'd convinced me to abandon. This is insane. You're throwing away our marriage over nothing. I'm not throwing it away. I'm ending it. There's a difference. She was crying now, but they weren't the strategic tears she'd used in previous arguments. These were panic tears, the kind that come when you realize you've miscalculated badly. Please, we can fix this. I'll change. I'll give you more space, more freedom. I picked up my steak and headed toward the grill on the back patio. You had 3 weeks to break your silence and apologize for being unreasonable. Instead, you doubled down on the punishment. Now you get to live with the consequences. Where am I supposed to go? I paused at the door. Remember your sister? The one who's always telling you that you deserve better than me? Maybe she has a spare room. Her first words in 3 weeks had been criticism and demands. Her last words, as I closed the patio door behind me, were desperate pleas. I was no longer interested in hearing. The next 30 days were a masterclass in standing firm when someone realizes they've lost all their leverage. She tried everything, the tears, the anger, the bargaining, the promises to change. She even broke out the ultimate manipulation tool, threatening to hurt herself if I went through with the divorce. That one actually made me laugh, which probably wasn't the reaction she was expecting. 5 years of marriage, I told her. And the only time you threaten self-harm is when you might lose access to my house and my paycheck. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. She moved through the stages of grief like she was following a textbook. Denial came first, where she acted like the divorce papers were just me being dramatic and everything would go back to normal once I cooled off. She kept cooking dinner for two, doing my laundry, trying to slip back into the routine that had worked for her for years. I started doing my own laundry and eating most of my meals out or at friends' houses. Hard to slip back into old patterns when I wasn't there to participate in them. Anger was next. She'd follow me around the house, listing everything she'd sacrificed for our marriage, everything she'd done to make me happy, all the ways I was being ungrateful and selfish. According to her, I was throwing away a perfect relationship because I was having some kind of midlife crisis. Perfect for who? I asked during one of her rants. Because I can't remember the last time I felt happy or relaxed in this house before you started your silent treatment. That shut her up for about 12 hours. Bargaining was the most pathetic stage. She offered to go to therapy, to change her behavior, to give me all the space I wanted. She even suggested we could have an open marriage if that's what I needed. Anything to avoid losing her comfortable lifestyle. You're offering to fix problems you spent 5 years denying existed, I pointed out. Where was this flexibility when I wanted to grab a beer with friends? 2 weeks into her 30-day notice, she tried a different approach. She invited her sister over for what I assume was supposed to be an intervention. Her sister had always disliked me, always told her she could do better, always encouraged her to be more demanding in our relationship. I came home from the gym to find them both in my living room, clearly having planned some kind of confrontation. She says you're forcing her out with nowhere to go, the sister started before I'd even put my gym bag down. She has somewhere to go, I replied. She just doesn't want to go there because it won't be as comfortable as living here for free. This is her home too. I pulled out my phone and showed them the real estate documents. Her name isn't on the deed. Her name isn't on the mortgage. She lives here because I allowed it, not because she has any legal right to it. The sister looked uncomfortable. Well, she's your wife. Not for much longer. And even if she was staying my wife, she lost the right to live here when she decided marriage was about controlling and punishing me instead of supporting me. They tried tag-teaming me for another 20 minutes, but I'd had 3 weeks to practice not engaging with emotional manipulation. I just kept stating facts. The house was mine. The marriage was over. She had 2 more weeks to find alternative living arrangements. When they finally left, she tried one last desperate move. She offered to sign a postnup, giving up any claim to my assets if I just let her stay in the house. You don't get it, I told her. This isn't about money or property. This is about the fact that I don't want to be married to you anymore. You spent 5 years training me to believe that wanting basic independence made me a bad husband. It took 3 weeks of silence for me to realize you were wrong. The final week was actually peaceful. She'd moved into the guest room and stopped trying to change my mind. Maybe she'd finally accepted that her nuclear option had backfired completely. Maybe she was just focused on packing and planning her next move. I spent that week making sure the transition was clean. I closed our joint accounts after transferring her half of the money. I had her car title transferred to her name and made sure the insurance was updated. I even paid for her security deposit on the apartment she'd finally found across town. Not because I felt guilty, but because I wanted this finished properly. No loose ends, no excuses for future contact, no reasons for her to claim I'd been unfair or vindictive. On moving day, I helped load her stuff into the truck, not out of nostalgia or second thoughts, but because I wanted to make sure everything that belonged to her left with her. When the truck was loaded and she was about to leave, she turned back to me one last time. I hope you're happy, she said. It wasn't quite a blessing, but it wasn't quite a curse either. I already am, I replied. For the first time in 5 years, I wake up looking forward to my day instead of worrying about what mood you'll be in. She didn't have an answer for that. After she left, I stood in my driveway and looked at my house where I could watch whatever I wanted on television, where I could have friends over without permission, where I could go to the gym without guilt trips, where I could live without constantly calculating how my choices would affect someone else's emotional state. The silent treatment that was supposed to punish me had given me the greatest gift possible. It showed me what freedom felt like. And once you remember what freedom feels like, it's impossible to go back to voluntary imprisonment. I pulled out my phone and texted my brother, "Barbecue this Sunday. I'll bring steaks." His response came back immediately. "About time. We missed you." Yeah, I'd miss me too.